So today we're going to be taking a look at La Cosa Nostra, also known as the American Mafia, also known as This Thing of Ours, through the eyes of Joe Bonanno's autobiography, A Man of Honor. Now, the Mafia is something that's fascinated tens of millions of people, and I think very much for good reason. All of the betrayals, the rises, the falls, the friendships, the brotherhoods, the alliances, the backstabbing, a lot of the various larger-than-life figures have a very Shakespearean quality to them. And it really plays out in real life more like kind of a Shakespeare play or an opera than just about anywhere else in modern society. You also just see a lot of things that have kind of vanished from the popular mindset. Things like honor and loyalty and a code of silence and respect and all these kind of micro social cues that can get you killed. It's just very much this whole client-patron, semi-feudal relationship. So like I said, we're going to be looking at this through the eyes of Joe Bonanno. Now, before we get in, just to kind of give a bit of context, in America, there are 5 families: the Lucchese, the Genovese, the Colombo, the Gambino, and the Bonanno. So as you might have guessed, one of the 5 families was named after him. So Joe Bonanno is interesting because he was the longest ruling boss of one of the 5 families, ruling for over 30 years, and unusually dying in his own bed of old age rather than getting taken out. He lived to be 97, by far the longest lived and longest ruling major boss. I think Frank Costello was 85, so he outlived him by quite a while. He was also the youngest man to ever become a boss of one of the 5 families. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was the only boss to ever be promoted straight from soldier to boss without being a capo or underboss or having some other higher position first. Now, he was an arch conservative and in a lot of regards the leader of the conservative faction within the American Mafia. There is a liberal and conservative faction within the Mafia, and we'll talk about this a bit as we go. But it's kind of at its core, it's about, do they want the Mafia to maintain its Sicilian character, or do they want to kind of modernize more, adopt more kind of aspects of American culture, open it up to people who aren't just pure Sicilian? How closely do you want to enforce discipline? It's kind of a bit of the conservatives more see it as a feudal old world institution, and the liberals more see it as kind of a corporation. So Joe Bonanno survived somehow 30 plus years as the boss of a major family and was able to retire quietly to Arizona, where he lived to the age of 97, by far the longest lived boss of one of the 5 families. And it's close between him and I think Lucchese, but he is, to my understanding, the longest reigning boss of one of the 5 families. So when he was in retirement, he decided to write his autobiography, A Man of Honor, to try to kind of get his side of the story in, as he had been kind of sidelined and kicked off the stage ignominiously. Now, the book was controversial from a lot of perspectives. The Mafia saw him as a rat, as someone who is exposing the inner workings of everything, someone who is naming names, who is just kind of giving the whole game away. Mob history historians have also said that the book is very biased, that he deliberately makes himself look good, he excludes a lot of details, and sometimes fabricates things. And I think a lot of this book was probably, or one of the impetuses was to get revenge against rivals and the people who had wronged him and overthrown him by making them look like snakes and traitors. That all being said, it's one of the very few primary accounts of the era, particularly the very early Mafia. By the time he wrote this, pretty much everyone who had fought in the Castellammarese War or remembered New York before the foundation of the Commission was dead. And to get kind of a detailed first-hand account of this era, even if it is biased in a lot of ways, is very fascinating. So I would actually recommend reading this book if you have any interest in Cosa Nostra. So, back to Joe Bonanno. So he was born in 1905 in Sicily and immigrated to the U.S. in the 1920s. So we're just going to talk a little bit about Sicily because this is where Cosa Nostra comes from. Now, it's important to keep in mind that within the United States, There's a tendency to call all Italian organized crime mafia. And generally speaking, Cosa Nostra is used interchangeably with the term mafia. But it's a little more complicated than that. Cosa Nostra refers specifically to the criminal tradition that comes from Sicily. There's a whole bunch of other Italian ones. There's the Camorra, there's the Nadringata, the Sacra Corona Unita. There's a whole bunch of other ones, and they will often be called mafia in the United States because they're Italian-American organized crime, but they aren't Cosa Nostra in the sense that they don't have the particular structure and particular rules. An example of this is the Chicago outfit. That is the family that Al Capone led, never really formed as a traditional Cosa Nostra family. They're a Italian-American crime group that has some aspects of it taken, but also parts from a whole bunch of other things. It's unclear whether or not they make all of their members. They go through an initiation ceremony or not. And it was debated for a long time whether Al Capone ever got made. So how this came out of Sicily is Sicily has been invaded a lot of times in the past. It's a very poor region of Italy, resource-starved. There's often not been a central government. So the people there are kind of used to resisting invasion. They're used to oppressive government or a lack of government. And so interpersonal relationships and kind of a feudal character became incredibly important. Whereas whoever is the local strongman or the local men of honor would kind of exercise authority in terms of doling out justice, doing some basic social services, stuff like that. It depends a lot, but Cosa Nostra has to be understood in the context of Sicily specifically. So we have the term mafia. So this is another thing that is very debated. Now, it's kind of confusing because it's often shortened into mob in English, and mob also just means a large group of people. But some people say the etymology comes from mahayas, which means swagger or boldness in Arabic. Sicily has been periodically invaded by the Arabs. In Sicilian, there's mafioso, which means boastful, proud, or sly. Some people also claim it was an acronym for Death to France in Italy, which was during the period of the Italian Wars. Bonanno, for his part, uses it in a similar fashion to cool or tough. That guy has mafia, that girl is mafia. Basically kind of like how we would use, like I said, the word cool today. In 1863, there was a play, I Mafiosi della Vicaria, which popularized the word. And by the 19th century, prior to kind of the mass migration to the United States, it had both positive and negative traits, that you were spirited, honorable, but also you were a ruffian or a thug. So you can have kind of it's a bit, I guess, like Rogue, where you can be the charming rogue, the Robin Hood type, or you can just be a thug. So let's talk a bit about Joe Bonanno's childhood. So he was born in 1905 in Castellammarese del Golfo, the sea fortress on the Gulf. It's a place with a very long and highly developed mafia tradition. It produced a lot of mafiosi. The future Bonanno family in New York was known as the Castellammarese family, and it was composed of pretty much just people from that town and the surrounding area. So he grew up amongst probably the most traditional and most conservative branch of Cosa Nostra within Sicily. And that would come to shape the rest of his life. He had that line in Goodfellas, from when I was very young, I wanted to become a gangster. And he says something to that effect, when I was really young, I wanted to become become a man of honor. So he just got exposed to respect, secrecy, honor, and reliance on local power. His family and him moved back and forth. Now, to my understanding, he was unusually well educated for someone who would eventually enter the mafia. And in his book, it's probably more the person he got to write it for him, but he uses a lot of big words and literary allusions that he just kind of plops in. That I think he's trying to cultivate his image as a philosopher king. So he settled down permanently in America in the 1920s after Mussolini's fascist crackdown on the mafia forced many Castellammarese to flee. So Mussolini basically destroyed the mafia in Italy. He wiped out a lot of the organized crime gangs and forced them to flee. The Allies put them back in power when they were invading, as they offered to help them, like control the local population, give them intelligence and stuff like that, if they restored them to their previous role. So kind of an interesting aspect to that. The Castellammarese identity gave really tight kinship bonds that made them unusually cohesive compared to the rival families. Like in the rival families, you'd have people from Sicily, but you'd also have people from Naples or Calabria or just other parts of Italy. Whereas in the Bonanno, what would become the Bonanno family, a lot of the guys knew each other from the old country, or they knew family members of the other people from the old country. And so it functioned a lot more like a cohesive clan unit. Now, just a side note, if it gets confusing with me changing between family names, the names of the 5 families change over time. The names got frozen in the 1960s, where they named all the families over who was the boss at that particular time. But prior to that, they would just be named after who the leader is. So we'll go through like the Mazzaria, then the Luciano, then the Costella, and then finally the Genovese family. And in the case of the Bonanno family, they were previously known as the Castellammarese family. Sorry if my pronunciations of this is not very good. So, Bonanno's induction in Maranzano. So, like I said, Bonanno arrived in New York in the early 1920s and settled in Brooklyn. He worked a bunch of legitimate jobs, bakeries, that kind of thing, while making underworld ties. He formally became a made man by the late 1920s at a very young age. Like, he was barely in his early 20s by the time he got made, wherein for a lot of people it can take decades. Now, this is another kind of open question. It depends on the time period. He probably had to kill somebody in order to do it. This is inconsistent in the mafia. Sometimes they will require you to kill somebody, especially if you're more of an enforcer type. But if you're more of a racketeer, or you're more of like a union guy or something like that, they may not want you to kill somebody because you're more useful to them as a businessman without that on your record and without the cops trying to tie you to that. So he drew really close to Salvatore Maranzano, another Castellammarese, and he became his protege. And he entered the 1930s as a young soldier in Maranzano's faction, positioned for rapid rise. This is very common within the mafia, where you'll have a major figure who will kind of adopt someone to be his lieutenant, to be the guy who he trains. If you ever watch any of Sammy the Bull stuff, Toto, who was a senior captain, kind of took him under his wing and taught him the ways of the mafia and stuff like that. So he kind of became Maranzano's right-hand man. It's also kind of useful in a political sense because Bonanno would be completely reliant on Maranzano's patronage, whereas some of the capos would have their own power bases as well. So Maranzano saw himself as a Caesar, as a Roman-style general and lawgiver. He wanted to rebuild the mafia exactly how it was in Sicily, but further centralize it and formalize it. And as you go through the early parts of the book, he loved Maranzano deeply. Like, he goes on and on about how he was basically the greatest man he ever met, how noble he was, and all this stuff, how he embodied Sicilian culture. It sounds very much like a hagiography, and at points it almost kind of gets embarrassing to read. And this, combined with his early childhood, gave him a very strong ideological commitment to preserving Cosa Nostra as he understood it. So before we get further in, I want to talk about what a made man is, because this is something that comes up a lot, but I don't know how well it's understood. So a made man is also called a wise guy, a good fella, a man of honor, a soldier, or a friend of ours. If you're a made guy and you're introducing another made guy, you say this guy's a friend of ours, or you say, oh, there's Pete, he's a friend of ours, that means that that person is a made man. If they say a friend of mine, that means the guy is an associate or, well, a friend of his. It means he's not a mafioso. So a made man is someone who is a fully inducted member of Cosa Nostra. So the requirements vary by era. Originally, it was only people who were Sicilians on both sides. Then it became all Southern Italians. People made fun of Al Capone because he was from Naples. Then it became all Italians. And then during kind of the more liberal period, you only required an Italian father. And then by the 1990s, when the mob swung back in a conservative direction, you required 2 Italian parents again. So you require the sponsorship of a capo or another senior member. I think it can sometimes be a more senior made guy. I've been through a lot of stories, and it kind of depends on the time period. But regardless, capos always have the ability to propose someone to become made. They have to have no ties to law enforcement. You can't be a drug addict. You can't be an alcoholic. Sometimes if you're a compulsive gambler, they exclude you. But once again, this varies a lot. You have to be someone who they've known for a number of years, who they trust implicitly, and who they think can keep secrets and maintain discipline and will do anything that the family asks them. So you'll sometimes hear about the books being open or closed. Open means they're accepting new members, and closed means they're accepting no new members. And sometimes the books will be closed for decades. I forget if it was the 70s or 80s where they were just making too many guys. And so there was a cooling off period where they just closed the books for like 20 years. There's been a couple local mafia families who have just kind of accepted their own extinction, and they never really opened the books again, and they just kind of allowed themselves to quietly die out. Now, most criminal organizations have some sort of equivalent of a made man. The Yakuza does. I think the Triads do. I'm not entirely sure if the drug cartels do, but it's someone who's a fully initiated member who has all the privileges and responsibilities due to it. And you're not just a peripheral figure, you're a core member of the organization. So the ceremony of making a man is interesting. So it's a small private gathering, normally in a back room, a cellar, or a safe house. There will only be senior members present. So you will go, generally speaking, you'll get a call that says you're going to be fitted for a suit and to be ready to be picked up. There's also straightening out is another one that is often used. So you'll be picked up by your capo or whoever sponsored you. They'll take you there. They will prick your trigger finger to draw blood, which symbolizes your willingness to shed blood for the family. They will give you a card of a saint or Mary, and you will drip the blood onto the card of the saint, and it will be lit on fire, and you have to hold it while it's being burnt. And the oath is, as this burns, so will my soul if I betray my family. So you have to make your oath to Cosa Nostra above all else. The family becomes before God, wife, and children. You have to swear to omerta, or silence towards outsiders, and to never betray mafia secrets. Senior members embrace him and say you are now a man of honor, and he gains the rank of soldier after that. So, being a made man, recognized as a friend of ours, no longer just an associate. A made man is sacrosanct. He cannot be touched by anybody without the boss's approval, and that includes by other made guys. So if another criminal attacks a made man or touches him or roughs him up, the family will automatically try to kill that guy. In a lot of cases, there's no, they can't even pay restitution, they can't negotiate. It's an absolute principle, you can't hit a made guy. And this applies from made guys to other made guys. They're supposed to resolve things peacefully or through negotiations. You can only whack another made guy if you have the boss's permission. You receive deference from associates, a certain degree of we're all equals within Cosa Nostra, and you tend to be respected by other criminals. Made guys will run their own crews. So they'll have a bunch of rackets. Normally, a made man will have a team of associates around him who will kind of be his muscle, or they'll be like, I don't know, in a professional field or something, but they'll help him run his rackets. Stuff like unions, loan shark, and gambling. If arrested, the family theoretically is supposed to provide legal and financial aid to him and his family. This seldom happens. And the made guy can rise to higher ranks, such as capo or underboss, and he can sponsor new members. So there are a lot of responsibilities, though. Some people choose not to become made men because of the additional responsibilities and because you, generally speaking, have to kick out more money. So firstly, there's omerta, never reveal mafia secrets to law enforcement, never talk to anybody who's not a made guy about family business. Even then, you're just not supposed to talk about anything. You are loyal to the family above everything else. If your boss tells you to kill your wife because he feels like it, you're supposed to just go ahead and do it. You obey orders from superiors without question. You have to generate steady income from the family. You have to kick up a portion of what you make to your capo, who then kicks it up to the administration. And you have to ensure that you're making money on a consistent basis, or you can get in trouble. One of the things you can be asked to do is murders or enforcement, and it's you're in it for life. Once made, you cannot quit. You can only die. In practice, though, some people do retire, or some people become semi-retired, where they're still technically part of a crew, but they don't really spend that much time doing it. However, a lot of people in this life don't really make it to old age, so it's not as big an issue as you might have thought. So let's head into the Castellammarese War. So by the late 20s, the Mafia in America, as it were, had coalesced into two major factions. The Masseria side, run by Joe the Boss. You may notice that like half the members of the Mafia are named Joe. I don't know what to tell you, that's just the way that it is. And then you have the Maranzano side. And Joe the Boss launched an attempt to become the boss of bosses and dominate all the other families, and just kind of to become the undisputed leader of the entire American Mafia. And his side was much stronger on paper. They had more soldiers and resources, but it was much looser. It was kind of a federation of a bunch of different groups that were nominally loyal to Masseria. And as time went on, it fractured more and more. Maranzano's side is smaller, but because they were all Castellammarese and they were all very personally loyal to Maranzano, they had basically no cracks. No one betrayed them. No one leaked information. So they would punch a lot above their weight. Now, I wanted to take a second to just go through and look at all the people who were involved in the Castellammarese War, because the founder and namesake of all of the five families, other than Joe Colombo, who's significantly younger, was involved with it. So let's take a look, and if you know anything about the Mafia, you'll recognize a lot of these names, especially given the family names. So Masseria's side, you have Joe the Boss. You have Charles Lucky Luciano, who would become the boss of the Masseria and eventually what would eventually become the Genovese family. You have Frank Costello, also known as the Prime Minister of the Mafia, who was Genovese boss during the 1950s. You had Vito Genovese, obviously the guy that it's named after. You have Carlo Gambino, Albert Anastasia, and Al Capone. Al Capone was kind of on Masseria's side, kind of not. It's sort of confusing. And then on Maranzano's side, you have Salvatore Maranzano, Joseph Bonanno, Stefano Magaddino, the longtime head of the Buffalo crime family, Joe Profaci, who would become leader of one of the five families, which would later become the Colombo family, Tommy Gagliano, and Tommy Lucchese, who would eventually found the Lucchese family. So all the founders of the five families were involved in this war. Although Joe Colombo was not on the scene yet, and the Profaci family would be named after him. So we have the course of the war. So it very quickly becomes a stalemate, wherein Masseria theoretically has the advantage on paper, but people were becoming disillusioned with him, and they didn't think he had it to win. And so Lucky Luciano, being the cunning man that he is, decides he's going to betray Masseria because he wants the war to end. It's bad for business. If neither side is going to claw out a victory from this, then all that's happening is people are just unable to earn, people are getting shot, and it's drawing too much heat from law enforcement. So Luciano invites Masseria to a lunch at Coney Island. And so, you know, in The Godfather, where you have Michael going into the bathroom to get the gun, what winds up happening is Luciano and Masseria are talking. Luciano excuses himself to go into the bathroom, and then a bunch of hit guys, including Genovese, Anastasia, and I think Frank Costello, come in and gun Masseria down while Luciano is in the bathroom. So that destroys Masseria's faction. Luciano is given control of the Masseria family, which becomes the Luciano family and eventually the Genovese family. After this, Maranzano formally declares himself to be boss of bosses. He reorganizes New York into the 5 families and demands tribute from all of the families. Now, why Luciano and a lot of kind of the Young Turks, or however you want to call them, had sided with Masseria is he was seen as being more American, more pragmatic, more willing to work with non-Italians. But as the war kind of started, people saw that, no, he was just another old school boss with a whole bunch of ego and stuff like that. And when Luciano decided to side with Maranzano, it's debated whether he was planning to also kill Maranzano after he switched sides, or he thought Maranzano might come around, or he could control him, or something like that. But that clearly isn't the case. And a couple months after Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses, Luciano murdered him in his office. And Luciano could have seized the title boss of bosses, and people would not have really rejected that. He might have even been able to hold it for a long time, but he rejects that and creates the commission. So throughout the Castellammarese War, Bonanno was Maranzano's right-hand man. Like I said, he writes about him in almost hagiographic terms. Maranzano was to be the best man at Joe's wedding. Joe saw him as a father figure. Now, one of the most interesting parts of the memoir is after Luciano whacks Maranzano, Joe Bonanno responds with basically almost no reaction. He seems completely indifferent to the man that he worshipped getting killed, and in particular the man he worshipped getting betrayed. He kind of does some copes that, like, power went to Maranzano's head. He was no longer fit to lead the Americanized Mafia. One would think that that Lucky constantly snaking the people who are supposed to be his superior would disturb a man of honor, but it apparently didn't. The war had killed off a lot of the leadership, and Bonanno had really distinguished himself, and he was kind of the chosen heir of Maranzano. So he was elected boss at the age of 27. I think he was the only case of being promoted straight from soldier to boss, and he reigned for 33 years. Sorry, he was elected at the age of 26 by acclamation. It's interesting in the book when that happened. So let's take a bit of a side look at Lucky Luciano, a.k.a. Charles Lucky Luciano, a.k.a. Salvatore Luciania. Sorry, I'm bad at some of these pronunciations. A lot of people will anglicize their names. Like Frank Costello was Francisco Castellano, but they will anglicize them, or they will adopt an American equivalent or something they think sounds a little bit similar. So in Lucky's case, he adopted Charles as the equivalent of Salvatore. So he was born in Sicily and raised in New York. He rose under Joe Masseria, but later betrayed him. So he's known as the architect of the modern American Mafia. He made it uniquely American. In particular, he was very tightly connected with a lot of members of the Jewish Mafia. If you've seen the show Boardwalk Empire, him and Meyer Lansky are basically brothers in it. They're best friends. And for most of his life, he was kind of philo-Semitic. I remember when the U.S. government went to him when he was in jail to try to get his help to control the New York docks during the World War II. They asked what they could bring him in terms of his favorite food, and he said kosher pickles. So he orchestrated the murders of Mazzaria, Maranzano, and abolished the title Capo de Tutti Capo, or Boss of Bosses, and created the Commission as a board of directors that would govern the 5 families. So he's an interesting case of someone who turned down absolute power, or who decided it was better to rule from behind the scenes than to paint a massive target on his back. So let's talk a little bit about the Commission, because we're just kind of going through what happened after the Castellammarese War. So the Commission was created by Lucky Luciano in 1931, and it replaced the Boss of Bosses system. Now, the title Boss of Bosses was still used if someone was was in a dominant position within the mafia. It would often be used to refer to that person, like Paul Castellano was referred to as the Boss of Bosses, Carlo Gambino was, Frank Costello was. It very much depends on the era, but it would sometimes informally be used. So the idea was to establish this board of directors to prevent another Castellammarese style conflict, provide a forum for disputes. They could do things like divide territory, coordinate national rackets, and maintain a balance of power amongst the families. So some things it did was they would ratify new bosses. They would have to approve if a boss was elected. In practice, it was a rubber stamp, but they were able to do that. They were the only ones who could approve or forbid the murder of a boss. They would coordinate national rackets, gambling, union, construction. They decide on things like the rules on selling narcotics, mediate dispute between families. They would determine what the membership requirements were. And it depends on the era, but they would have to approve people who were getting made. So they would have like a list that they would pass around. I don't think they required approval, but the families would have vetoes over who would be made in other families. And so the Commission brought a lot of stability and structure, and the mafia functioned way better after it came about. Local bosses started to act more like CEOs, and it just created an environment that was conducive to people making money. So the legacy of it is it waxed and waned over the decades. It effectively became defunct when Joe Massino, the last Don, flipped. So the Commission consisted of 7 permanent members, the Luciano/Genovese family, the Megadino/Gambino family, the Galliano/Lucchese, the Profaci/Colombo, and the Bonanno family. I find it funny because Joe ruled the family for so long, there wasn't an earlier version. It also included the Chicago outfit and the Buffalo family. So these people had permanent seats. Sometimes if a particular local group was very prominent, they would get a temporary seat, or they would vote, pass in their votes, or have one of the other families represent them. So, one more interlude. Let's talk a bit about how a family is actually structured, because I've been alluding to this, but I think it's important to kind of cover this. So prior to the Commission, one of the things that Luciano did was standardize the mafia structure and clearly define what the different rules are. So prior to the Commission, it was very loose. There would be factions, or there would be a strong man. A lot of families wouldn't have an underboss or concierge. Authority was personal, charismatic, and it was based on violence and blood ties. So like I said, Luciano standardized the hierarchy based on Maranzano's model. You had the boss, the underboss, the concierge, and the capos. It took a much more corporate structure with a very well-defined chain of command and accountability. And this made it a lot easier for the Commission to enforce rules, as you knew what was responsible for what when. So as I said, Chicago outfit is not strictly Cosa Nostra. It's its own thing. Al Capone, it was debated whether or not he ever was a made man. I think during the Castellammarese War, the Masseria family made him because it was embarrassing to have the most famous Italian American criminal not be a made guy. So they kind of did that as a way of kind of baptizing the family. So let's talk a bit about the hierarchy. It's very clear and very clean and very simple. So you have the boss, or Don. In The Godfather, this would be known as the Godfather. Bonanno always called himself the father of the family, and they are the undisputed leader of the organization, and they hold autocratic power. Next, you have the concierge, who is a counselor and advisor to the boss. They're a trusted friend and confidant, usually the number 3 man in the family. It's kind of the strangest position. Their job is to be an advisor to the boss. They're supposed to be the main guy who can speak to the boss very kind of bluntly and without filtering things. They're often the diplomat who goes and talks to other families, or if people in the family have an issue with the boss or a capo or something, they can go to the concierge and they'll try to work it out. It's often someone who's a bit older. It's someone who's an expert in the laws and rules of Cosa Nostra. But it's kind of odd because it's not formally part of the chain. It's a very senior position, but it's not directly in charge of anything. You then have the underboss. Sometimes you also have a street boss. So the underboss is often the heir apparent for who's going to take over when the boss dies. Sometimes they will make it their son, or sometimes they'll make it the person who they want to be their successor. Succession in the mafia requires the approval of the capos, although it depends a bit on family. Generally speaking, if the previous boss was well respected and he picked somebody, like in the case of Carlo Gambino, they will immediately approve his successor. Because of how it works with omerta and stuff like that, it's often the case where the boss will pass his orders through the underboss, so they'll never be able to directly tie him to any particular crime, and people below the underboss might not ever really talk to the boss. Under the underboss, you have capos, who are the officers in the family. They command a crew of soldiers, and they hold absolute authority over the men in their group, and they're supposed to look out for them, and the members of the group kick up some of their income to them, and then they kick it up to the administration or the top 3 positions. We then obviously have soldiers, also known as just made men. Lowest members of the crime family, they have to take the oath and go through the process. And then below them all, you have associates. A lot of the time in movies, if you see a guy who seems to be part of the mafia who's not Italian, like Henry Hill in Goodfellas, they're an associate. Now, sometimes the associates can be extremely important. Sometimes they can be some of the top money makers, and they can de facto outrank a lot of actual members of the family, like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were Jewish, so they couldn't be made, but they were very high-ranked associates. And generally speaking, a made guy will have a crew of associates that'll work with him on doing things. And they have the protection of whoever the head of their crew is, but as they're not made guys, they don't enjoy the specific protection afforded to a soldier. Anyway, so we get to the quiet 1940s. So things were going pretty well under the First Commission. Luciano's commission system prevented another major war. Masseria and Maranzano were dead. Eventually, Lucky got jailed and exiled. It's kind of funny with Lucky because he got jailed and exiled under a pandering charge. I think it was related to forced prostitution. Most people agree that the charge was complete nonsense, but they knew he was a mob boss and they wanted to get him for something. So you kind of had like the big 3 most ambitious leaders out of the way, and you had kind of this council of equals set up, so things were pretty stable. The Bonanno family had never been the wealthiest or poorest of the families. They, generally speaking, in line with kind of Joe's conservative outlook, they just tried to keep it quiet and make money. In that regard, they're a bit like the Gambino family, but even more low-key. Avoid flashy violence. They, at least in Joe's opinion, tried to act as like some sort of feudal overlords of the neighborhoods they controlled. Joe opposed certain things. He was against narcotics, although people always in the mob sold drugs. Now, this is something you'll see a lot, and this was in the Godfather, the question of whether or not the mafia engaged in the drug trade. Now, the reality is the mafia has always been involved with the drug trade. It's kind of a case of don't ask, don't tell, or don't get caught. Wherein, okay, if you're doing drugs and you're making money and you kick up and I don't know you got the money from drugs, then it's cool. But if I find out that you're selling drugs, then I'm going to have to kill you. And so this will be portrayed as some sort of moral principle. And to a certain extent, some of them had objections to it, particularly selling drugs within their own neighborhoods. The real issue, though, is drug charges are just have unusually long sentences, and it's extremely easy to convict someone. If someone's carrying a big pack of cocaine around with them, it's pretty easy to prove that that person's a drug trafficker or a drug dealer, whereas trying to prove union corruption or bid rigging is a lot more difficult. And the penalties are a lot less. So oftentimes, and you see this a lot in The Sopranos, they would catch someone with selling some heroin. They'd be facing 20 years to life, and then they would flip. So Joe Bonanno had an alliance with his cousin Stefano Magaddino, the boss of Buffalo, and with Joe Profaci, another very conservative boss. And the commission was pretty evenly split between liberal and conservative blocs, with conservatives generally having a plurality. So he was seen as being cautious and old world, less flamboyant than some of the other major families. So the question you're probably asking yourselves is, how did these guys make money? And this is a very good question, and it's something that's kind of overlooked, and it's a little bit more complicated than people think. Joe very, very strongly tries to avoid talking about where he got his money. He talks a lot about the cheese company he ran. He talks a lot about his dress factories, his funeral homes, all his legitimate businesses. And you got to wonder, like, where did he get the money to set all this stuff up? And the answer is, of course, through rackets. So the core rackets of the mafia is policy numbers or the Italian lottery, bookmaking, like sports betting. They would run underground casinos, or in the case of Vegas, they'd run actual casinos. There would be loan sharking, lending out money at a high interest rate, extortion, wherein they would pay protection money to avoid harassment. We'll talk about that in a second because it's actually a bit more complex than people think. Unions were often controlled by the mafia. So they would make the businesses, like construction companies or construction real estate developers, pay them to avoid a strike, because they would have controlled the media, so they could bring any construction project to a stop unless they got paid off. There's like bid rigging, like where they would not pick the lowest bid. They'd pick bids from a mafia company that would inflate costs. The construction industry is kind of a mess to begin with, so inflating things every here and there and overcharging in some places or unexpected costs on another is normal to begin with, and trying to figure the whole thing out is kind of a mess. So prostitution was another thing they were involved in, but it was normally delegated to associates. Joe claims that he was against it. His family was still involved, although to be fair, to a lesser extent than some others. Narcotics were very divisive. Many bosses, such as Bonanno, opposed it. Individual crews profited heavily, but again, less involved, but still involved. There's also things like truck hijacking, just general burglary or robbery, and eventually we branch into more kind of white-collar schemes. So here's the interesting thing, though, about protection money. So it's not just extortion. It's not just give me money and you're under a protection, but they don't actually provide protection. In an era when the police forces were much less effective than they were now, it did represent real protection. Normal criminals would not touch your business if the mafia was protecting you. If they did touch your business, they would get whacked. And they would do other stuff for you. They would eliminate rivals. Like in The Sopranos, you have Barone Sanitation that Tony works for, and he draws a salary from them and he takes a kickback. And it looks like he's just kind of doing rent seeking, but he gets his guys to beat up or drive out all the competitors, so Barone Sanitation can charge monopolistic prices. So while they have to pay Tony off, they're still making more money than they would if Tony was not involved. They can pressure suppliers to lower their prices if they're selling to a mob-associated business. They do provide real security, and they can prevent labor unrest. A lot of businesses paid the mafia because it was cheaper than constant theft or hijacking. And savvier mobsters tended to reinvest profits into semi-legitimate businesses and real estate, because real estate is just a very good way to launder money, because there's basically infinite ways to bill and raise costs and to do shenanigans. And so we head into the 1950s, the calm before the storm. So we have Frank Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the Mafia, ran the Mafia very much like a CEO. He had a lot of connections to judges, senators, and Tammany Hall. Someone who could move in polite society. I feel like it might have even helped him to have that little bit of an edge to him, or a little bit of that exotic appeal as like this rogue gambler type thing. His official profession on the his tax return was professional gambler, which is pretty funny. So he tried to favor low-profile, high-profit things like gambling. Like slot machines and casinos are a way to make a lot of money, but they don't attract attention in the same way that like contract killing does. So Joe Bonanno kind of had a similar view of things. He liked to project the image of being a respectable Sicilian businessman, real estate, funeral homes, dairies, cheese importing, garment trucking, and cafes or bakeries. So he would just buy up a whole bunch of normal businesses. So Bonanno prided himself on having a larger share of clean income than a lot of bosses. He was not one of the wealthiest bosses. That was probably Carlo Gambino, who might have been a billionaire when he died. It's very hard to tell, considering how secretive Carlo Gambino was. But what would happen with some of them, and Joe is an example of this, is they would eventually have enough legitimate assets that they could just retire and live off of that. We don't know exactly how much money Joe had when he retired. He probably had about $10 to $20 million in legitimate assets that allowed him to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Probably he got about $1 million a year in income from his various businesses. So Costello was leader of the liberal faction, and Bonanno was the leader of the conservative faction. But both of them didn't like violence. They didn't like shenanigans. There was kind of an unofficial stability block where they just wanted to keep things calm so everybody could earn. And they preferred that as opposed to Albert Anastasia, the CEO of Murder, Inc., whose nickname was the Lord High Executioner. So we head into the return of Vito Genovese. So Vito came back. He had been in exile prior to and during World War II, and he got in good with Mussolini and worked as a war profiteer for both the Axis and the Allies. He had fled the country because he was charged with murder. However, the sole witness died under mysterious circumstances, conveniently, so he got off about it. So he did not like Luciano's system of collective rule. He wanted to revive the boss of bosses model and centralize the American Mafia. So they had the big meeting. You'll see this in some mafia movies in Havana, Cuba, where all the bosses got together and decided on how they were going to divide up the country. Luciano was in exile in Italy at this point in time, but he was able to come there because it wasn't the United States. And while he was there, Vito begged him to end the commission, become boss of bosses, and make him in charge of everything in the United States. Luciano told him to screw off, and that didn't happen. So Vito decided he was going to take things into his own hands. So he ordered a hit on Castello, carried out by Vincent the Chin Gigante. It's always fun in these when you see people who will become important later on and they get like a cameo. He would later become the head of the Genovese family, also known as the Odd Father. So Castello survived the hit. The bullet grazed his skull. It was millimeters away from killing him, but he got the message and he decided to retire. Castello was once again one of the few mafia bosses who got to step away. He had tons of legitimate money and businesses and property, so he would live the rest of his life in relative comfort. He would still have some influence in the mafia, but he just didn't want to go to war with Vito at that point in time. Genovese then murdered Albert Anastasia, which allowed his ally Carlo Gambino to become head of the Gambino crime family. So this is where we get, and you'll see this and I think analyze this in some other movies, the Apalachin movie meeting where Vito summoned all of the leaders of the American Mafia, not just the 5 families, but the minor families, and he was going to get them to legitimize him as the boss of bosses and kind of be Masseria or Maranzano reborn. So we're just going to do a little interlude. So in the Mafia, there's generally speaking, and Michael Franchise has talked about this, there is racketeers and there are enforcers. Or in the case of bosses, there are people I like to call businessmen and warlords. You have people who want to run their family like a medieval fiefdom, and you have people who are more concerned with making money. So the focus of businessmen bosses is money, stability, and peace, whereas for warlords, it's power, fear, and control. Businessmen bosses try to have a lot of money invested in legitimate things. Carlo Gambino, in particular, had a lot of money in the stock market. They would own construction companies. Kind of a thing that they would like to do is semi-legitimate business. So they would own a construction company that would do actual construction work, and the work would be of a passable quality, but they would get contracts for the company at inflated rates through their connections to the unions or politicians. Whereas the more warlord types thought that it was like a pansy thing to have legitimate businesses, and they preferred to just make money through violence. A lot of the more businessmen bosses either would, like Carlo Gambino, lived in kind of a crappy house and drove a clunker despite possibly being a billionaire. Frank Castello and Paul Castellano both lived in the open, but they lived the life of kind of like a wealthy, somewhat sleazy businessman, which, I mean, they had a mansion, or in Frank's case, a penthouse, but it wasn't in really a warlord way. It was like, oh, there's another somewhat seedy businessman in New York. They were a dime a dozen. Warlords tended to like to be flashy and well known. So some examples of some people who would be considered businessmen, like I mentioned, Lucky Luciano, Frank Castello, Paul Castellano, Carlo Gambino, Meyer Lansky. Some people in the other category would be John Gotti, Al Capone, Vito, Albert Anastasia, and Salvatore. And just to kind of put in some fictional examples of more businessman types would be Carmine Lupertazzi from The Sopranos, Gustavo Fring, Michael Corleone, Nucky Thompson, Professor Moriarty, and Winston from John Wick. Whereas the more warlord types are Phil Leotardo, Tony Montana, Tuco, Fran Sanchez, Billy the Butcher, Chalky White, and Tommy Shelby. So we have the Apalachin meeting. So Genovese's move. So he tried to cement power after sidelining Castello and killing Anastasia, seeking to become recognized as the boss of bosses. He gathered 60 bosses and senior mafia leaders from across the country, and they were going to meet at Joe Barbara's estate in Apalachin, New York. It was going to ratify Genovese leadership, formalize involvement in the drug trade, and settle all existing territorial disputes. Unfortunately, it was leaked, and state troopers raided the location. You had this comedic thing of all these guys just running through the woods and fields. All kinds of people got arrested. It was a complete and total disaster. Prior to this, the FBI under Hoover had tried really hard to deny that the mafia existed because it would imply that there was this massive organized crime network that they had no real ability to control. And they kind of had to admit it after this. So the outcome is Genovese was humiliated and blamed. The bosses turned against his boss of bosses' ambitions, and it was permanently sidelined. So Bonanno's version of this is that he warned others the gathering was a mistake, and he did not personally go because he said that this was going to be a disaster and he wanted to keep his family low profile. So he framed this as prudence and foresight compared to Genovese's blunder. So it's quite possible that he wasn't there. Now, his driver's license was found at the scene. So some people might say, well, maybe he just gave his driver's license to, like, his driver or something, and he was able to run away. I guess his explanation was that he had asked a soldier of his to pick up a renewed driver's license for him, and the guy was kind of scatterbrained, and he just never really, kept forgetting to give it to Joe. So when he went to the Appalachian meeting, he had it in his wallet, and so Joe was kind of implicated. I mean, it's a little bit of a stretch, but it's not like a crazy story. I mean, you've had to pick up documents lots of times, and they'll be sitting in your car for weeks, and you keep forgetting to hand them over. Law enforcement were never able to place him at the scene of the crime, so it's quite possible he didn't show up. Also, he was a prudent man, so that's also likely. And he hated Vito Genovese. He thought that he was just a snake and a man with no honor. And so we head into the Bonanno napping, which is the most bizarre episode in Bonanno's long career. People asked me to cover this, and I spent quite a bit of time trying to even figure out what the hell happened, because this whole thing is really weird. So, Joe Bonanno was subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury investigating mafia activities. He was going to face possible indictment for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The night before his testimony, he vanished from Manhattan under mysterious circumstances and remained incognito for the next 2 years. So, Joe does not mention this in his book, but we're pretty sure this happened, that prior to his disappearance, there was a 4D coup plot. So by the mid-60s, Bonanno's conservative bloc was collapsing. He had a falling out with his cousin, Magaddino, who had defected to the liberal side. Joe Profaci had died in 1962. His successor, Magliocco, was also a conservative, but he was terminally ill and was likely to not live very long. If his successor was more liberal, then the conservative bloc would probably permanently lose its plurality, and the liberals would just be able to vote through whatever they wanted. So he saw this as his last best chance to preserve Sicilian-style Cosa Nostra. So he worked with Magliocco and came up with a plan to assassinate Gambino, Magaddino, Lucchese, and the LA boss. And in the chaos, he would seize power over the commission, make himself boss of bosses, and install Magliocco as his number 2. And he wanted to return Cosa Nostra to a feudal Sicilian-like guild order and purge a lot of the Americanization that had turned it into a corporate structure. Now, it's kind of weird because he was very much a businessman, but he also didn't like the corporate structure. I think, once again, he wanted it to operate more like a medieval guild or like an actual secret society of businessmen rather than just a corporation with ties to shadiness. So the 4D chess plan obviously failed. Magliocco handed out hit contracts to his top guy, Joe Colombo. Joe Colombo immediately snaked him and went to the commission. The commission exposed the plot. Magliocco had to retire and had to pay a penalty. Colombo was rewarded with his own family, the Profaci family that Magliocco had headed, which is today known as the Colombo family. And so Bonanno's family was left isolated. All his allies were either gone or flipped. He was summoned to explain himself before the commission, and his fate was likely to either be death or forced into retirement. So there was this, and then there was the grand jury indictment. But there was one thing in this case that Joe Bonanno would never do as a man of honor, and that's run away from a fight. So this is what Joe's version of events are, which doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm being very, very charitable in this, because I'm extrapolating from the vagaries he had. So he claims there was no coup plot, that the commission made it up, it was COINTELPRO or whatever. They were jealous of him and his prestige, and they hated him that he wanted to maintain honor and traditional Sicilian values in a rapidly changing America. So he said that his cousin, Megadino, kidnapped him the night before the grand jury. He didn't run away from the grand jury. He didn't try to avoid getting arrested. He was kidnapped, conveniently. He was held for weeks in a remote New York hideout. Megadino would visit. He would do schizo posts IRL and yell about how jealous and resentful he was and how Joe was wealthier and more successful and better looking. And it very much comes across as him bragging. So after weeks of this, they released him for some reason. They drove him to Texas, and he left and then went into hiding at his Arizona home. And he stayed in his home, getting some of his trusted lieutenants to bring him food and money and stuff. And he plotted his return. So whether the commission was actually involved in his kidnapping, we don't know. Whether or not there was even a kidnapping, we don't know either. It seems really weird that the commission was involved. They would kidnap him after he had tried to carry out a coup and then just kind of let him go. We're going to look at what the alternatives are. So this is what probably happened. Here's a couple realistic versions of it. Option one, and probably the most likely one. The feds were coming after him. He was about to be indicted. The commission was probably going to whack him. So Bonanno fled to Montreal or Arizona and hid there until the heat died down. That seems very plausible to me. That's probably what wound up happening. He saw it as a no-win situation that either one side or the other was going to get him. So he figured discretion was the better part of valor and he should just get the hell out of there. Now, in his story, he portrays it as Megadino, it was a complete coincidence. He was kidnapped the night before the grand jury. Megadino didn't even know about it. It just somehow he picked that one day. If we're going to be a bit more charitable, we can say that Megadino kidnapped him when he did because he was afraid if Joe went to jail, it would shield him from mafia justice. So he acted alone and kidnapped him. Now, this might not have been directly on the orders of the commission, but Megadino could have known that the commission was talking about how to deal with Joe Bonanno, and he said, well, I'm just going to kidnap him and hold him so that he's not in government custody for when they make their decision. And then the third case is that the commission directly ordered Megadino to abduct Bonanno. So either he wasn't kidnapped, Megadino did it on his own initiative, or the commission got him to do it. And so here's the weird question. Why would they let him go? Because in most of these scenarios, he was at the complete mercy of his enemies who had plenty of evidence to execute him with. So my understanding is to kill a boss, you need the unanimous consent of the bosses on the commission. And they might not have been able to get a supermajority or everybody to agree. Some of them might have said exile. Some of them might have said forced retirement. Some of them might have said, let's whack him. And it was just a deadlock, and it was kind of a hung jury type scenario. Something I could see as being likely is they forced him to swear an oath that he was going to retire. or wind things down or otherwise get out of the way, and they wouldn't kill him if he agreed to live. Maybe it's just no one could bring him to do it because, once again, he's like the last of the antediluvians. He's from another era. He has a very high amount of prestige, and people might just not want to wanted to kill him out of that. It'd be like killing Lucky himself. So regarding this, Bonanno went into exile on Elba. So he hid in Arizona and Texas, where he had loyalists and business ties. The commission appointed a new boss of his family, De Gregorio, who was a very weak and ineffective boss. So while he was in hiding, he plotted his big comeback. He communicated with loyal soldiers through intermediaries. He kept a profile. He didn't go to court. He didn't talk to the commission. He was still wealthy. He still got some racket money, but he could mostly at this point in his life live off of a legitimate business and real estate income. And he said it was a prudent retreat. It was a tactical retreat. It was not running away. So the commission declared him unfit to lead. They deposed him. They put Gaspar de Gregorio in power. And it immediately led to a civil war within the Bonanno family between the commission-backed side and the Bonanno loyalists. And so we head into the Bonanno War. Now, it's not called the Bonanno War because it involved bananas, like the U.S. invading Central America. It's called the Bonanno War because it's Joe Bonanno. So I tried to put together a timeline because this whole thing is hard to follow. So the Bonanno War starts in 1964, where Bonanno disappears either through being kidnapped or running away. The commission installs Gaspar de Gregorio as boss, and then the family splits the next year. The commission-backed faction versus the Bonanno loyalists, led by his son Bill Bonanno, who's taking Joe's orders over long distance. And this led to ambushes, shootings, attempted hits, but it was a stalemate. It wasn't really going anywhere. One of the issues was a lot of the loyalists supported Joe, but they didn't like his son. They thought he was a schmuck or incompetent or unworthy to succeed him. And there was confusion as to if they won, would Joe come back or would his son become leader? And it divided the loyalists. So Joe made his big return like Jordan in 1966. The war was still going on. He was able to resolve his legal disputes with a short sentence. De Gregorio had terminal cancer again. This happens a lot, probably because these guys smoke and drink so much. So he was sidelined for poor health, and the commission was very frustrated with the stalemate. Seeing that it wasn't going anywhere, Joe finally conceded and retired quietly to Arizona with all his assets intact, and the commission agreed to not harm him or his son. His son, I think, was allowed to remain like a nominal capo, but he wasn't really allowed to have his own crew, and eventually he just left the mafia more or less and went into media and other business dealings. And so this left the Bonanno family fractured and weakened, and it was now by far the weakest of the five families. So we have the aftermath. This left the Bonannos deeply divided. They went through 5 bosses in 5 years. I didn't mention some of them, but basically between hits, resignations, and I think like 3 of the 5 of them had like terminal cancer. They kept electing people who were like months away from the grave. And no organization can survive turnover that rapid, especially in something this autocratic and centralized. The years of civil war wrecked rackets and destroyed the livelihoods of many members. The family never regained the stability it had under Joe and was plagued by repeated factional conflicts in the following decades. Alongside the Colombos, the Bonannos became extremely unstable. I think the Colombos had like 3 civil wars. The Bonannos had a whole bunch. As you've seen Donnie Brasco, they had the whacking of the 3 captains. And so they went from being probably the most stable of the 5 families to a shattered shell of its former self. So Joe's last retreat, kind of like Napoleon's last retreat. So he retired to Arizona. This seems to be a place where a lot of mobsters go. Sammy the Bull famously retired there. And he focused on his legitimate businesses, his real estate and investing, investments, ranching, being kind of a country gentleman. He tells a story about how he was friends with Billy Graham and just a lot of other notable people in the area, judges, lawyers, bishops, and stuff like that. And he served a couple short prison stints for things like contempt or obstruction of justice, but he never got like a major racketeering charge. He didn't serve that much time in jail. It was just kind of short stints periodically. And so in retirement, he decided to write A Man of Honor, framing him as the last link to the Castellammarese War and the founding of the Commission. So he tried to shape the narrative that he was a man of tradition betrayed by greedy modern bosses. And this was a kind of revenge, exposing the mafia structure and all of his enemies without him technically being a rat, although a lot of people saw him as a rat. So this guaranteed himself a legacy, but it earned pretty much the universal hatred of everyone within the mafia. So, Joe Bonanno died in 2002 at the age of 97, having witnessed the mafia's rise and fall. Basically, he was alive during the entire existence of the Commission, and the American Mafia as we know it now. It sort of exists now. It's very confusing and vague. He outlived every other major boss, with Frank Costello being the second longest at 82, and everyone else being much less than that. He had the rare privilege of dying free of natural causes and not in prison or shot. And despite him losing power in an embarrassing fashion and being exiled, in a sense, he kind of won. He won at life. He died in his own bed at an old age, living comfortably off of the assets he was able to keep from his life of crime. And that's kind of an interesting, I don't know if contradiction is there, but an interesting kind of complexity to the situation. So his tell-all book tarnished his reputation with the mafia itself, but history kind of partially vindicated him. There was constant defections, loss of discipline, FBI pressure, and drug trafficking destroyed Cosa Nostra. Basically all the stuff that Joe Bonanno had warned about wound up coming to pass. So he was a rat, and he'd exposed all this stuff, but he was also largely correct in his assessment. So, Epilogue Part 1. Donnie Brasco and the Commission Case. If you haven't seen Donnie Brasco, highly recommend it. Great movie. So the Bonanno War had left the family fractured, weak, and desperate for manpower. They were just making anybody, and that opened the door for disaster. Amidst this whole mess, FBI agent Joe Pistone. Joe Pistone's done a bunch of interviews. He did a really good one with Michael Franchise. I recommend going and watching it. He's a very interesting guy. He infiltrated the Bonanno family as Donnie Brasco. He was sponsored by Capo Sonny Black Napolitano. He was almost a made man at some point. He was undercover for 6 years. When he eventually came out, it humiliated the Bonannos. His mentor, Sonny Black, got murdered. The Bonannos got kicked off of the commission, and it would be like a decade before they were let back on. The ironic part of this is a couple years later, we had the commission case, where there was a RICO trial involving all the members of the commission. Since the Bonannos were no longer part of the commission, they were excluded from this. They were also just seen as losers who weren't worth going after. And so all the other families got devastated by this. And this is 1985, but then we also had the whole affair with Gotti and the other RICO trials and stuff during the 1990s. But my point being, when the other families started to get hammered again by a renewed effort of law enforcement, they were largely left out because they had been excluded. And so we finish off with John Massino, also known as the Last Don or the Last Boss. So he restored discipline after years of chaos. The Bonannos became respected again. He expanded into unions, gambling, construction, and narcotics. He was an ultra-conservative. He banned flashy behavior. They weren't allowed to say the term mafia anymore. Very strict silence. Under his leadership, the Bonannos were finally able to rejoin the Commission. Sometime during his rule, basically all the other bosses were in jail, so the Commission just consisted of him. And he was able to just pass through as many conservative policies as he wanted. And so we have this irony where at the end of the mafia, as we know it, you had the boss of the Bonanno family basically becoming boss of bosses and able to pass whatever conservative legislation he wanted completely unopposed. However, in 2004, he was convicted in a RICO trial. And facing life without parole, he became the first of the 5 family bosses to flip. With him flipping and him ratting on everybody, the Commission still theoretically exists, but it's basically defunct at this point in time. And so ironically, the Bonannos came in at the last inning, hit a couple home runs, but they still wound up losing the game. And his flipping and the death of the revival and the collapse of the Commission basically symbolized at long last the final death of the Mafia's golden age. Today, it's kind of hard to know what the Mafia is even doing. It's so shattered and so disorganized. It's hard to tell even how many members there are, let alone what they've been up to. The 5 families still exist in one form or another, although they're just shadows of their former selves. The Genovese have been able to adapt the most. The FBI calls them the Ivy League of organized crime, and they tend to be the best at doing online and white-collar scams. The Gambinos are still going decently strong, and the other 3 families, I think, are in decline. But once again, it's very hard to tell, the whole secret society thing. And basically, they took so many body blows, it's kind of hard to recognize the bloody mess that's left. And so that ends our exploration of the American Mafia. We went from Sicily with the birth of Joe Bonanno, its early years, the Commission, when it became the 5 families that we all know and love, and to its basic end, where we are today, with the 5 families still technically existing, but limping along, destroyed by RICO and drug charges. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I know it was long, but there was a lot of stuff to cover. I hope people appreciate when I do these. These take a lot of time and effort. I enjoy them a lot, but it's nice if people appreciate them and they enjoy them. And I know I put out less content now, but I like to think a lot of it is much better quality than it used to be. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless everybody, and more content to come.